March 7, 1945. Remagen, Germany. 3:50 p.m. The afternoon light cuts through the industrial haze hanging over the Rhine, casting long shadows across the steel lattice of the Ludendorff Bridge. The air tastes of cordite and river mud. From the eastern bank, Oberleutnant Karl Schilling presses his field glasses against his face with trembling hands, watching what should be impossible. American tanks, hulking mechanical beasts painted in olive drab, are crossing his river. Not in rubber boats under cover of darkness, as intelligence had predicted they might attempt in weeks to come. Not with pontoon bridges assembled painstakingly under artillery protection. They are crossing now in daylight across a bridge that by all rights should no longer exist, under a storm of German fire that seems only to make them more determined. Schilling can hear his own breathing, rapid and shallow, competing with the thunder of 88mm guns positioned in the hills behind him. Each impact against the bridge structure sends visible shudders through the ironwork, yet the American column does not stop. Through the scope, he watches a Sherman tank navigate around a crater on the bridge deck, its tracks grinding against twisted metal, and he realizes with a cold certainty that the war he understood, the war he was trained for, ended the moment those first American boots touched the western span. The Rhine was not simply a river. For the German military command, for the soldiers who had retreated across its gray waters through the winter of 1945, it represented the last defensive line of the fatherland itself. Every German schoolchild knew the Rhine from poetry and song, the great artery of Germanic civilization, the boundary that even the Roman legions had struggled to cross permanently. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had built his entire defensive strategy around the premise that the Allies would require weeks to mount a crossing operation, that the Wehrmacht would have time to regroup, to consolidate the battered remnants of divisions torn apart in the Ardennes and the Siegfried Line. Every bridge across the Rhine had been wired for demolition. Engineers had inspected the charges personally. Plans called for the systematic destruction of every crossing point from Switzerland to the North Sea. The standing order was absolute. No bridge could be allowed to fall intact into Allied hands. The Rhine was more than a military obstacle. It was a psychological fortress, the place where German soldiers told themselves they could still win, or at least fight to a negotiated peace. When Schilling had withdrawn across the Ludendorff Bridge 3 days earlier with what remained of his reconnaissance company, he had looked back at the structure and felt something like relief. Let the Americans come to the river. Let them spend their strength against that ancient barrier while Germany gathered itself for the final stand. But the American forces approaching Remagen on that mild March afternoon were not the exhausted, supply-starved enemy that German propaganda continued to describe. The men of Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division, represented something the Wehrmacht had failed to fully comprehend even after years of fighting. The sheer material power of American industrial might translate it into operational tempo. These were not the green troops who had stumbled through the hedgerows of Normandy. They had learned their craft in the crucible of the Bulge, where they had faced the best Germany could throw at them, and emerged victorious. They moved now with the confidence of men who knew they were winning, but more than that, with the material abundance that allowed them to take risks that would have been unthinkable for their opponents. When Lieutenant Karl Timmerman of a company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, first spotted the Ludendorff Bridge, still standing through his field glasses that afternoon, his immediate impulse was not caution but opportunity. In the German military tradition, with its careful planning and its respect for proper preparation, such a moment would have triggered a halt, reconnaissance, consultation with higher command. Timmerman radioed his superiors and received permission to take the bridge in a conversation that lasted minutes. The American military doctrine, built on the principles of initiative and aggressive action, transformed a fortunate accident into a historic breakthrough with a speed that left German commanders still waiting for their own orders to reach them through proper channels. The German soldiers positioned to defend Remagen expected to face an assault that matched their own military philosophy, methodical, prepared, proceeding according to doctrine. They had seen the American army fight for months, had respected its artillery and air power, its seeming inexhaustibility, but they had not fully internalized what those advantages meant for American tactical thinking. When the 1st American Infantry began advancing across the Ludendorff Bridge shortly after 4 p.m., German troops opened fire from positions in the tunnel on the eastern bank, from pillboxes on the heights above, from hastily prepared positions in the town beyond. Machine gun fire raked the bridge deck. Mortars began to find the range. The Germans expected this fire to pin down the attackers, to force them to withdraw, to buy time for the demolition charges to be properly prepared and detonated. Instead, they watched American soldiers run through the fire, spreading out, taking cover behind the bridge's steel supports, but continuing to advance. Behind them, tanks began to roll onto the western approach. The weight of a Sherman tank is 33 tons. The Ludendorff Bridge, built in the First World War, had never been designed to carry such loads in rapid succession. German engineers watching from the eastern heights waited for the structure to collapse under its own strain, to accomplish through physics what their weapons had not. The bridge shuddered, swayed, but held. At 4:15 p.m., German engineers at the eastern end of the bridge triggered the demolition charges. The explosion, when it came, was wrong. Instead of the shattering, total destruction that should have dropped the entire center span into the Rhine, there was a muffled roar and a gout of smoke. The structure shook violently. Debris showered into the water. American soldiers threw themselves flat on the deck, expecting to fall, to die, in the cold, gray water below. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. The charges, hastily replaced after the Americans approached too quickly for proper preparation, had been inadequate or improperly placed. Some accounts suggest sabotage. Some blame damp electrical connections. The official Wehrmacht report would cite American artillery fire cutting key wires. The reason mattered less than the result. Through his field glasses, Oberleutnant Schilling watched American soldiers pick themselves up from the bridge deck and continue advancing, and in that moment he understood that he was witnessing not just a tactical failure, but a symbolic collapse. The Rhine, the last line, the place where Germany would stand, Americans were crossing it on foot, in daylight, under fire, and there was nothing German firepower could do to stop them. The first American tank reached the eastern bank at 4:22 p.m. Sergeant Alex Drobick of Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, became the first Allied soldier to cross the Rhine since Napoleon's armies had done so in pursuit of the Prussians more than a century before. Within the hour, more than 120 American soldiers had crossed. By nightfall, 8,000 Americans would be across. Engineers would begin work immediately on additional bridges, on reinforcing the Ludendorff structure, on establishing a bridgehead that would prove impossible to dislodge. In Berlin, when the news reached the Führer's bunker, Hitler's rage was apocalyptic. He ordered the immediate court-martial and execution of the officers responsible for failing to destroy the bridge. He demanded counterattacks to throw the Americans back across the Rhine. He diverted forces desperately needed elsewhere to attempt the impossible task of dislodging the American foothold. None of it mattered. The Americans had crossed the Rhine, not through overwhelming force or brilliant strategy, but through speed, initiative, and the kind of calculated risk-taking that an army rich in resources could afford. They had seen an opportunity and seized it before the Germans could react, and in doing so had rendered weeks of German defensive planning irrelevant in an afternoon. What German soldiers defending Remagen cannot fully comprehend, what German military tradition had no framework to process, was the American relationship with material and risk that made the Remagen crossing possible. When Lieutenant Timmerman ordered his men onto that bridge, when the decision was made to send tanks across a damaged structure under fire, the Americans were making calculations that German doctrine would have deemed reckless. But American recklessness was underwritten by abundance. If tanks were lost in the crossing, there were more tanks in the supply columns stretching back across France. If the bridge collapsed with men on it, there were more men, more engineers, more pontoon bridging equipment already moving forward. The American army could afford to take risks because it fought with an industrial base that could replace losses at a rate that seemed to German observers like something from fantasy. A German panzer division, once destroyed, might be rebuilt in months if at all, its losses in experienced crew and irreplaceable equipment effectively permanent. An American armored division could absorb equivalent losses and be back at full strength in weeks. This was not simply a matter of numbers, but of philosophy. The American military had internalized the lesson that in modern mechanized warfare, speed and initiative could be their own form of protection, that moving too fast for the enemy to react was often safer than moving slowly with elaborate preparation. German soldiers watching American tanks pour across the Ludendorff Bridge in the days following its capture struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told about their enemy. The propaganda had described Americans as soft, unmilitary, lacking the warrior spirit that German discipline instilled. The reality crossing the Rhine was something different. These were not supermen, not fanatics willing to die for glory, but they were professionals who moved with confidence and competence, who fought with a combined arms coordination that the Wehrmacht itself had pioneered but could no longer match. American infantry and armor worked together seamlessly, supported by artillery that seemed capable of delivering crushing fire on any target within minutes of being called. German counterattacks against the Remagen bridgehead, launched with whatever forces could be scraped together and thrown into battle, broke against American defensive positions reinforced with a speed that seemed impossible. Anti-tank guns appeared in positions that had been empty hours before. Minefields materialized across approaches that German reconnaissance had reported clear. The Americans, it seemed, could build faster than the Germans could destroy. The symbolic power of the Rhine crossing extended far beyond its immediate tactical significance. For German soldiers who had been told for months that the war could still be fought to stalemate, that Germany could hold the Western Allies at the Rhine, while new wonder weapons turned the tide, Remagen represented the death of that illusion. Grenadier Wolfgang Herder, captured during the German counterattacks in the Remagen bridgehead in mid-March, would later describe the psychological impact in his interrogation. "We knew when we saw them across the Rhine in such strength that the war was finished. Not finished in months, but finished. There was no more line to fall back to. There was no more time for the new weapons to be produced. There was only retreat and more retreat until there was nowhere left to go." This was the transformation that Remagen worked on German military consciousness, not simply the loss of a river barrier, but the extinguishing of hope. Wehrmacht soldiers had absorbed terrible losses before, had retreated before, had seen their defensive lines pierced. But always there had been another line, another place to regroup, another phase of the war to enter. After Remagen, there was only the end. The sound that came to represent the Remagen crossing in German memory was not the crash of artillery or the rattle of small arms fire, but the rumble of American tanks moving at operational speed. Day and night, across the Ludendorff Bridge, and then across the pontoon bridges that American engineers threw up alongside it, across the tactical bridges built at other crossing sites as the entire Allied front surged toward the Rhine, came the endless column of American armor. Sherman tanks, lighter and less powerfully armed than the German Panthers and Tigers, but available in numbers that rendered their individual inferiority meaningless. Tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, armored personnel carriers, trucks carrying infantry, and supplies in quantities that German logistics officers could hardly believe. A single American armor division on the move consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that exceeded the supply available to entire German armies. And the Americans had dozens of such divisions, all moving, all supplied, all capable of sustained offensive operations. The rumble of their approach became the soundtrack of Germany's defeat, a physical vibration that German soldiers could feel in their bones as they fell back from one defensive position to another. In the nights following the initial crossing, German forces attempted to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge through every means available to them. Artillery fire pounded the structure constantly, forcing American engineers to conduct repairs under bombardment. The Luftwaffe, or what remained of it, attempted bombing runs that cost aircraft Germany could not replace in exchange for negligible damage. The Germans deployed V-2 rockets against the bridge, a waste of strategic weapons that illustrated the desperation of the moment. They sent frogmen downriver with explosive charges to blow the bridge supports, brave men on suicide missions who died in cold water without reaching their targets. The epilogue to Remagen was written in the weeks and months that followed as American forces drove deep into Germany and the Reich collapsed. The bridgehead established in those March days became the launching point for operations that would encircle the Ruhr, capture hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, and accelerate the end of the war in Europe. The Ludendorff Bridge itself, destroyed not by German action but by the simple physics of damage and overuse, became a symbol of different things to different armies. For the Germans, it represented the failure of their defensive strategy, the moment when the last great barrier fell, and the end became inevitable. For the Americans, it represented something else, the vindication of a military philosophy built on initiative, speed, and the aggressive exploitation of opportunity. The standing order in the American army was to advance, to maintain pressure, to give the enemy no time to recover or regroup. Remagen exemplified that philosophy perfectly. A chance discovery, a bold decision, a risky crossing, and suddenly the strategic situation transformed. But Remagen represented something beyond military tactics, something that the German soldiers watching those American tanks cross the Rhine understood at some level even if they lacked the framework to articulate it fully. They were watching the product of a free society mobilized for war. The American soldiers crossing that bridge came from a nation where debate and dissent were normal, where citizens questioned their government, where the press reported critically on the war effort. The German propaganda machine had portrayed this openness as weakness, as evidence that the democracies lacked the unity of purpose that totalitarian control provided. Instead, what arrived on the eastern bank of the Rhine was an army that reflected the strengths of its parent society, individual initiative valued and rewarded, tactical flexibility prized over rigid adherence to doctrine, a pragmatic focus on what worked rather than what theory dictated should work. The Americans had created a military structure that harnessed individual capability while maintaining coherent organization, and in doing so had resolved the tension that authoritarian militaries struggled with. German soldiers were trained to follow orders perfectly. American soldiers were trained to accomplish missions, with the means left largely to their discretion. At Remagen, that difference manifested in the split-second decision to cross the bridge immediately rather than wait for orders, and in the tactical flexibility that allowed American units to adapt their assault plan moment by moment as the situation developed. The material abundance that characterized American operations in the final year of the war was not simply an accident of geography or resources. It reflected a deliberate choice by American society to subordinate other priorities to war production, to transform its economy into what Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. That transformation required free workers in factories, not slave labor. It required innovation and adaptation, engineers and designers free to propose new solutions. It required a logistics system built on the same principles of efficiency and standardization that had created American industrial dominance in peacetime. The trucks and tanks and rifles that crossed the Rhine at Remagen were the product of a society that had proven it could outproduce the Axis powers while simultaneously maintaining living standards for its civilian population that far exceeded those in the totalitarian states. This was the core paradox that authoritarian regimes never resolved. Free societies, when aroused to military effort, proved capable of sustaining war production at levels that controlled economies could not match. The promise of totalitarian efficiency proved hollow when measured against the reality of democratic industrial power. For the German soldiers who survived the Remagen fighting and the battles that followed, who found themselves prisoners of war or simply survivors of a defeated nation, the memory of American tanks crossing the Rhine remained a defining moment. It was the point at which many realized that they had been lied to, not just about specific military situations, but about the fundamental nature of the conflict. They had been told they were fighting decadent democracies that would collapse when faced with determined resistance. Instead, they faced an enemy that grew stronger the longer the war continued, that learned from its mistakes, that brought to bear resources on a scale that made mockery of German claims of racial superiority or totalitarian efficiency. The Americans who crossed at Remagen were not supermen, but they did not need to be. They were ordinary men from an extraordinary system, a society that had proven it could mobilize for total war while maintaining the essential character of its democratic institutions. The bridge at Remagen no longer stands. The western towers remain, preserved as a memorial and museum, but the span itself was never rebuilt. The Rhine flows as it has for millennia, indifferent to the human struggles fought along its banks. But the crossing endures in memory, in the historical record, in the understanding of how the Second World War was won. It endures as a moment when superior material resources combined with tactical boldness to achieve strategic transformation. It endures as evidence that in modern mechanized warfare, the ability to take calculated risks and to exploit opportunities rapidly can be as important as firepower or defensive positions. Most fundamentally, it endures as a demonstration that free societies, when their survival demands it, can mobilize power on a scale that should have been impossible according to the theories of those who believed that only totalitarian control could create truly effective military might. The German soldiers who watched American tanks cross the Rhine that March afternoon were witnessing not just their own defeat, but the vindication of principles their government had taught them to despise: freedom, abundance, individual initiative harnessed to collective purpose. The rumble of those tanks announced the end of Hitler's Reich and the triumph of a different vision of how human societies might organize themselves. That sound echoed through the ruins of Germany and into the post-war world, a reminder that in the final accounting, the side with more food, more fuel, more factories, and more freedom had proven unstoppable.